Hey, hello, welcome everybody to Phoenixville Library and part 2 of our presentation on Chester County's historical places with Phoenixville Library's own volunteer tech help guru and intrepid amateur astronomer, yeah, maybe that's next, Dave Mosbruger. Dave, welcome again.
Thank you, Mark. It was probably presumptive of me. I assumed that people who saw that this was a part 2 presentation probably came to part 1, and for that reason I've foregone a whole lot of the introductory material from part 1. I do see new faces. If there's any questions when I finish, please come up afterwards and I'll try to fill you in.
And part 1 is available online on our YouTube channel, so yep.
So we're going to try to get through the introductory material pretty quickly so that we can go through more places. So I've got a button here that's supposed to change this. Just a reminder, as Mark said, I'm an amateur photographer. I'm not a historian. I'm not even a native of Chester County. Everything I'll be telling you tonight is information I pulled off the internet. In most cases, it's coming from nomination forms that are available on a Wikipedia site that looks at the Chester County historic places. And for each place, there's a references section. They will have often either the nomination form that was used for the site or a Pennsylvania Historic Resource Survey form. Well, that's the primary source of what I'm going to be telling you. Again, reminders, a place does not necessarily have to be old to be on the register. In the first session in the spring, I said from what I could determine it had to be at least 50 years old. It turns out that's no longer true. There are exceptions to that, and we will have one place tonight that does break that 50-year rule. Age by itself is not a qualifier. You may have a building in your backyard that was built in 1300. That does not make it eligible for the historic register. It has to have an area of significance, one or more, that goes along with it. And finally, some places don't like to be photographed. That's my way of saying a lot of these places, many of which are buildings, are far off the road, or they have hills in the way or trees in the way or whatever. As a photographer, it's just hard to get a good picture of them. This is still introductory in nature, as we were in May. In May I did 20 places. Tonight I'm going to strive to get to 30 places in about 45 minutes. It's probably going to be a little bit longer than that. But if you do have questions on any of the places, again, online has as much and probably more information than I do. I've tried to pick places that are not overly familiar to you. You may have noticed, we talked about a little bit, the Rass Bridge on the introductory slide. I figured everybody knows about that one. I'm trying to go a little bit further afield. And I also mentioned this spring that 2 townships, East Fallowfield and West Whiteland, together have roughly a quarter of the 320 historic places in Chester County. Instead of emphasizing those 2, I tried to spread out a little bit across townships. And we're going to do this by types. That's my term, that's not an official term. And we're going to start with bridges. After all, we had a bridge on the first slide there. Again in the spring, I mentioned at that time that during the pandemic, which is when I took most of these pictures, there was only one occasion on which I went up and knocked on somebody's door to ask permission to take a picture of one of the places. That happened to be this bridge that I was trying to get a picture of, and fortunately the gentleman let me on his property and I was able to get this photograph. And I'd like you to take a good look at this bridge. Hopefully you all can see this. It's just a beautiful stone bridge. Notice the arches down here, lovely stonework. Built in 1916. Wikipedia says it's in Downingtown. It's actually in Wheeland Township, a little bit above Thorndale. I didn't have time to make that, I just found that out tonight, this afternoon rather. And significance is engineering. I'd like you to compare that to bridge number 148, which is in Westtown Township. It's very, very similar. Built 5 years earlier. Again, significance is engineering. This is the only historic place in Westtown. These 2 bridges are both on the register because they were both built in the 20th century, but they were built using 19th century design and construction techniques. And you can tell these are very durable bridges. This, for example, is on Route 926, Street Road, a little bit east of where that intersects with Route 202. Very busy road, it's holding up fine. Bartram's Covered Bridge is the only covered bridge on the National Register in the County of Delaware. You're saying, wait a minute, this is a Chester County presentation. Well, This is Chester County. This is Delaware County.
Huh.
This is one of the 3 bridges that Chester County shares with other counties that are 2 big with Lancaster. And it turns out that all of Chester's county's covered bridges, with one exception, are on the historic register. The one exception is down on the Brandywine Preserve south of Coatesville, called the Hayes Clark Bridge. I believe the reason that one is not on the register is because it was originally built as a bird truss design similar to the Raps Bridge, but when it was rebuilt, they used a different design, which I think lost the character of the bridge. That's my guess. Again, I didn't find that specifically online. I picked this bridge for a very specific reason. If you've ever looked at covered bridges when you go near them, most of them have either horizontal planks on the side or vertical planks on the side. And the end portal will match that. So if it's horizontal on the side, it'll be horizontal on the end. This is the only covered bridge in Pennsylvania, and I hope you can see this, that has slanted portals here. So these go up, these go down. And you may have also noticed this bridge is no longer in use. This is the highway back here, and it does bypass the bridge now.
Is that Goshen Road? Is that Goshen Road?
Honestly, I don't remember.
It is.
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Switching gears, this is the Bradford Friends Meeting House in Marshallton. Main part of Marshallton and Strasburg Road are about a block behind this building. It's actually the 3rd meeting house that was built in this area, plus for a while the Friends used one of the Marshalls' homes for their meetings. The original house was log. It was torn down, a stone meeting house was put up. That second one was located behind where I stood to take this picture, in an area which today is a cemetery. This one was built in 1765, and it's been in continuous use since that time. The only real change to the architecture has been the addition of this porch, which is on this end and on the side. And apparently this is unique among the meeting houses because most of them had 2 rooms, one for the men and one for the women. This one has 4 rooms on the inside. And the thought is the other 2 were probably used for meetings. I promised you a place that was less than 50 years old when it went on the register. This is it. Whittier C Atkinson was born in Georgia, one of 23 children, 17 of whom grew to adulthood, and apparently many of them grew to become professionals in their chosen fields. Whittier turned out to be a doctor. He moved from Georgia to Philadelphia, came to Coatesville, went up to New York City for a while, and came back to Coatesville where he saw a need. The need he saw was that the Coatesville did not have a wonderful history with race relations. And the Coatesville Hospital would not allow African-American physicians to practice. They admitted very few African-American patients. Dr. Atkinson happened to be African-American. If any of his patients were admitted to the Coatesville Hospital, he was not allowed in to treat them. So he set up his own hospital, and this is it. Anytime on these slides that you see an overhead view, which is what this is, I've kind of grabbed these from Google Maps satellite view. So this was Dr. Atkinson's house. One of the write-ups said he actually had 8 rooms from the hospital in this house. I'm not sure about that. He apparently did have a pharmacy in the basement, and he built an 8-room wing over on the side. You're kind of looking at the front of it here. Over time, that wing was lengthened, it was raised from 1 story to 2, it was widened, and they even put living quarters on the end of it. During one of those renovations, it was named the Clement Atkinson Memorial Hospital after his father. This was one of the 3 African-American owned hospitals in the state, one of the few places where the population could get quality care. And the problem he had was that he never turned away anybody. He did not just serve the African-American population. Anybody who could not afford to go to Coatesville was welcome to come here and get treated. Word got around. A lot of people came from Hartsburg. Some came from Philadelphia, apparently. Apparently he was lucky if he got paid. If he did get paid, it was often in vegetables or chickens. He was continuously trying to raise funds to keep this going. It helped out a little bit at one point because Blue Cross picked him up. But as time went on, he was not able to afford the newer and modern equipment that was needed to provide quality care, and Blue Cross dropped him. Finally, as the civil rights movement got underway, Coatesville Hospital did start accepting African-American physicians and patients, and in 1977, basically, he closed operations. Today, this is a community center. There are apartments in the wing, and there's a men's shelter in this also.
I noticed something very unusual on that. There's an outside cellarway off to the right there.
Yes, I don't know if that's original or not.
It probably was added at a later date, but it's an unusual arrangement.
Carver Court is an interesting subject also. Coatesville, as you know, had a couple of primary employers, Lucan Steel and Midvale Steel and Ordnance. Towards the beginning of World War II, the government decided to need to partner with these industries that were going to be critical to the nation's defense. At the time, the African American workers were given the most hazardous jobs. They received the lowest pay, and in most cases, they had really substandard housing. And this was not just true in Coatesville, this was true in many places. So the government designated Coatesville as a defense area, along with many other areas in the country. And they started building housing for the workers. Most of the houses they built across the country were temporary in nature. Coatesville was one of the, Westtown Township was one of the few places where they actually put up more permanent facilities. Excuse me. And there was a bit of a fuss because at one time they wanted to make this integrated housing. And people in Coatesville kind of said this isn't going to work. So what they eventually did is they built the Foundry Street housing development and the Lincoln Highway housing development. This is Coatesville High School. This is the Lincoln Highway development, also known as Brandywine Homes. Over here you have Carver Court, which was the Foundry Street development. And the thought is this was probably built on an old racetrack. This is the African American development. This was for the white workers. This one is not on the register. Carver Court is. 3 well-known Philadelphia architects were involved in this: George Howe, Louis Kahn, and our old friend from the last time, Oscar Stonerhoff. And Stonerhoff was one of the ones that convinced the government that if they wanted to get this going, they really needed to build segregated quarters. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. There were basically 3 styles of homes in here. There were the A's, the B's, and the C's. A's were single family, single bedroom. B's were 2 bedroom. C's were 3 bedroom. And they were all duplexes. So this is the C unit. Looks like it's built on stilts. The government, A, had funding issues, obviously, and they also did not want to compete with the local realty market. So these are basic houses. And what you have here is a house on stilts is what they call it. The first floor has storage space, utilities, and a carport, which could also be used by the kids on a rainy day if they wanted to get them outside for a while. All 3 bedrooms are in this section here, and as I said, there's another room unit like this over on the other side behind the tree. We're going to start a series of houses now. The Wikipedia page calls this the Lap Log House. The nomination form calls it the Hopper Log House. Take your pick. The story here is that East Whiteland was well settled by Welsh and English settlers. Early on, there were several stone quarries in the area, and so the English and the Welsh built all their buildings out of stone, including their houses. In the early 1800s, some German Swiss came in, and most of them looked around and said, oh, this area is full of English and Welsh, we're going to keep going. And so I'm guessing they wound up in Lancaster County and became the Amish and the Mennonites. But there was a group of them that stopped here for a while. They built the only Amish church ever built in this country. It's no longer there. But a gentleman named Lapp probably built this, and he was an owner for a time. This is a log house on this end, and it is the only log house in East Whiteland Township. Modified a bit over the years. On these slides, sometimes you'll see a relatively recent date after some of the early ones. That usually means there's been a renovation involved, and there was a renovation here in 1940. I can tell you I drove past this several times when I was working, and there was still renovation going on in the last 20 years or so it hasn't stopped. The nomination form does have a mistake. It says that this property is located at the intersection of Conestoga Road, which is Route 401, and Yellow Springs Road, which I don't think ever intersects Conestoga Road. It's actually at the intersection of Conestoga Road and Spring Valley Road. So if you head down 113, turn left on 401, heading towards 202, it'll be on the right-hand side, probably down the road there. Spring Valley actually runs behind the complex. You get much closer to the buildings, but they planted a number of bushes there, so it may be a little harder to see. Joshua Vaughn, another interesting character. He started off as a blacksmith, but he was apparently a very outstanding public speaker and drew crowds whenever he talked. He's very popular. They elected him to be the deputy sheriff of Chester County. He served as a custodian of the jail at Chester. And as he got to the end of his term, he decided he'd become a preacher. He was known as the fighting parson, apparently for his ability to deal with unruly youth. That wasn't detailed what that meant, but since he was a blacksmith, I can probably guess. He eventually took over the parson position. I'm going to mispronounce this, I apologize, at the Hezbollah Baptist Church. His house and the church are both on Strasburg Road down in East Battlefield. They're 2 miles apart. When I took this picture, it looked to me like this property had been abandoned. I really don't know what it's being used for today. Peter Harvey House and Barn, one of the places that doesn't really like to be photographed. This is the house, this is the barn, this is a different view of the house. You can see part of it still hiding behind trees here. James Harvey owned this land. He leased it to his brother William. Peter was William's son. They are pretty sure Peter is the one that built the house, because when they had a renovation in 1940, they found the date of his wedding inscribed on the plaster inside the house. In addition to which, he submitted some claim damage after the British troops marched through here. And again, it's just a very lovely setting, a little bit hard to see, but one of the few farming type areas in Canterbury. A little bit closer to home, the Wheeland House is located on Fellowship Road. And again, if you're not familiar with the area, if you were to take Route 401 west from 113, Fellowship is the last left turn before you get to Route 100. If you make that left and go down just a little bit, this house is on the right. The area used to be known as Fellowship Farm. And it's, again, architecture. This is considered, even though it's been modified somewhat over the years, a local interpretation of the Georgian architecture style. Notice that it's a 4-bay by 2-bay house. Now, I'll tell you on the next slide why I mentioned that. Nathan Mechner was a physician. He got his degree from the Philadelphia College of Medicine. He was a contemporary of Dr. Benjamin Rush. While he lived here, he wrote many articles for medical periodicals, which is why we have the medical publication aspect of this. The other reason, and again, I'm telling you what the nomination form said, this house is apparently unusual in South Coventry because most of their houses have 3 bays or 5 bays. So like the Wheeland House, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's nice. The other thing that might surprise you is you've probably never seen this house, even if you've driven out Route 23 any number of times. It's a little bit past Route 100 on the left-hand side. Most houses would have been built so 23 went in front of it. This one's built so Route 23 is on the end of it. So that's the other unusual aspect of this. I think it's a little bit lower down and it's got a lot of trees there, which is why I doubt you've ever seen it unless you actually knew what you were looking for. Southbrook Farm, we're still talking houses. Southbrook is a stream that runs through the property. Caleb Pusey, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, was a contemporary of William Penn's. Came over to this country with Penn in 1682. Stayed as Penn's agent, I believe, for some of the mill work. His house in Upland is still there. My wife and I were lucky to have a tour and given by Santa Claus one day by mistake. That's a different story. I won't go into here. But when Pusey retired, he moved to East Marlboro and built his house. That was roughly in 1713. And that house stayed in the Pusey family until roughly 1940. They sold it to a gentleman named Charles Higgins. Higgins was a chemist, an industrialist, and the president of the Hercules Powder Works in Wilmington. He was also newly married, and he decided the Pusey house was not suitable for a newly married captain of industry. He hired an architect, and I'll apologize again for the pronunciation. His name was Richardson Bronyard Oakey. Some people are nodding. You may know he was the one who renovated Betsy Ross House to turn into a museum. He also was the one that recreated Pensbury Manor from what he thought it should have looked like. considered one of the masters of the colonial revival style of architecture. So he took Pusey's home and turned it into this complex, and I think he's incorporated several buildings. I'll be honest, I can't tell you which part of this is the original house. I suspect it's back here, but I don't know. But today, this is considered one of the best examples of colonial revival architecture in the state of Pennsylvania. And it sits on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania's School for Veterinary Medicine. Mirstone, that's a Saxon word that means either boundary or border rock. Quite appropriate, because if I interpret my map correctly, if you draw a line through this building here that just clips the back corner of this part of the building, from there on over you're in Delaware. This way you're in Pennsylvania. That state boundary was resurveyed in 1921. I'm not sure if it was all in Delaware or what before then, but point is, this was built in several sections. Again, the original house is this section here. At the time, I'm not sure, can you see that there's a change in roof elevation here? It comes down and then it pops over like this. This building was actually about 2 feet wider than this one is all. That house and this addition were both built in the 1700s. In the 1800s, the owner expanded. They put a stone wing on this end of the building. At that time, they made this a common roof all the way across, and that's what created this porchway and the extra space below that. Then in 1942, the owner hired an architect by the name of Richardson Bronyard Oakey. He was a master of colonial revival architecture. Oakey came in and redid the place for him. So Oakey redid this roof line, he created these lovely arches, he did things on the inside, and he's also the one that had this stone wing on this end built. These last two were two of the last projects I believe that Oakey was involved with, if I remember correctly. Roughwood, last Tavern. This one I found just a smidge frustrating. There was a building here in 1805. There was a tavern that operated on the site from 1812 to 1865. This building, which is also this building, was built in 1819. So it's not clear to me, it was supposedly built as a guest house for the tavern. And I'm not clear if there was another building that has since been torn down, or if the original tavern was incorporated with this. Be that as it may, it was operated until 1865, and then went into private hands as a private house. Over the years, they've added a wing back here, which you see the front of here. That was a dining room parlor type of area, and then a kitchen wing in the back. Had several well-known occupants, whose names I can never remember. One was a Civil War hero. There was a publisher by the name of Ziegler, who was apparently big in the field of religious publications. If any of you from this area, there was a banker named Biddle, who I understand was pretty well known in the Philadelphia area for a long time. And one of the owners was the owner of a steamship line. In 1928, the owner hired an architect. His name was Richardson Bronyard Oakey. This is one of his earlier works. This was in 1928. And the write-up says that Oakey kind of treated this one with a light touch, if you will. Most of his work was on the inside. He didn't do a lot of rearranging of the outside like he did in some of his later efforts. Roughwood is the only remaining structure from the village of Glassley. Anybody here, Glassley? That's the precursor to what today we call Devon. I'll probably spend more time on this than most of the places. I found it a little bit frustrating. If you read the justification, it says that in September of 1777, a gentleman named Thomas McCain was staying here and wrote a very famous letter to George Reed. And that letter ties together the three Delaware signers of the Declaration of Independence. Well, I was frustrated because you only mentioned two of them, McCain and Reed. I didn't know who the third one was, so I tried to find a copy of the letter online and couldn't find it. But in my research, what I discovered is that McCain was actually born in Wheeland Township, Pennsylvania, on what today is the campus of Lincoln University. The building he lived in is no longer there. Moved to Philadelphia. Eventually moved down to Delaware and stayed with his cousin while he was getting his law degree. He was licensed to practice in both Pennsylvania and Delaware. And at the time the Continental Congresses were meeting, he and George Reed, who happened to be a classmate of his when he was younger, and was now a neighbor and a friend, and the third gentleman, whose name is Caesar Rodney, were the three Delaware delegates to the congresses. And they're getting ready to vote on the question of whether we should declare independence from Britain or not. Well, even though Reed and McCain were friends, they were on opposing sides. McCain was a staunch advocate of independence. Reed kind of liked things the way they were. And the way they worked it is each state only got one vote, and those two cancel each other out. Well, for whatever reason, Rodney was down in Dover, and he happened to be on McCain's side. He favored independence. So McCain shipped a message down to Rodney and said, hey, you better get back up here quickly, we're going to take the vote. Rodney supposedly rode overnight in a thunderstorm and got to Philadelphia just in time to side with McCain, and that's why Delaware voted for independence. All three of them did sign the Declaration, although I understand there are some copies that don't have McCain's signature. So there's some question as to when he signed it, but they're all on there. So getting back to the letter, another area I'm not clear on. This is 1777, of course things are going on now. The president of Delaware, a gentleman named McGinley, had been captured by the British and was in prison. And apparently McCain, and it's not clear to me if this is by virtue of the position he held in the Delaware government or if he just saw the need and stepped in, he took over as the interim president. Reed, at the time, was in Philadelphia, and he had been apparently the elected successor to McGinley. So this letter that McCain wrote went to Reed and said, hey, here's what I've done since I took over my interim president role, and I would really like you to come back and take over because I'm the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, and that's really what I want to be doing. Actually contacted the township, and they put me in touch with Sue Moon, who's the architect in charge of the Lynn's Tavern restoration project. I did bring with me, and have, if anyone else will see it later, her transcription of that letter. And it does talk about the steps that McCain took, one of which was to make Rodney a general. I hope you're not tired of talking about taverns, because here's another one, except this one is the tavern that never was. The story here is that there was a log tavern on this site. I'm pretty sure this was not it. And in roughly 1805, the licensing board refused to renew the tavern license because the proprietor of the tavern, who was not the owner, contributed to the drunkenness and disorderly conduct of his clientele. So the owner, I think, tore down the log tavern and built this brick building specifically to be a tavern. It does not have the normal items you find in a house. And his intent was to impress the licensing board with the fact that I'm willing to go forward and do what I need to do to improve the quality of the clientele and stop the problems that you're worried about. Well, the board said no. And one of the reasons they said no, there were a number of other taverns by now in the area, including one that was just a half a mile up the road from this one. So the owner tried a few times over the years. He never did get his license, and finally in 1839 they sold the building to a farmer. So that's the tavern that never was. And I still don't know what this is. Fox Chase Inn started off as another house, built in 1765. The architectural significance of this, it was originally built on something called the Penn Plan. And again, I'm not an architect, but I believe what that means is a 2x2 cube almost. So if you draw a vertical line roughly here, you can see we have a door and a window and two windows, essentially 2 bays by 2 bays. And when it came time to enlarge the house because they needed more space, they simply mirrored that on the other side. So this is one of the few examples of a dual Penn Plan building, if you will. It was the first tavern in Westminton Township. Ran as a tavern from 1786 to 1800. It was the only one of 4 applicants, I believe, that got a license. But by 1800, there were other taverns in the area. This sits at the northeast corner of the intersection of Ship Road and Sweetsford Road. There's something called the Ship Inn that's on the corner of Route 30 and Ship Road, and they think the clientele from here probably moved down there. At the time the nomination was written, this was owned by the Church Farm School. I think today it's in private hands. The Exton Park goes pretty much on 3 sides of this, but it does look like this was sold to a private individual. It is a 4-acre farm, and there's a barn over here. Be that as it may, that's the Fox Chase again. Talking about farms, here's Indian Deep. And I talked about some places don't like to be photographed. This is one of them. You might be saying, Dave, what are you talking about? That's pretty obviously the Indian Deep farm. My challenge is to find a good way to take a picture of the farmhouse, which is over here, hiding behind trees. It looks like it's been worked out quite a bit. In Middleton Township, built in 1750, this is a Centennial Farm, meaning the same family has farmed this continuously for 100 years. If you're familiar with the local area, you're not impressed. You probably know we have the French Creek Farm on Pewtown Road, just a little bit west of Kimberton. That's a bicentennial farm. That's been farmed continuously by the same family for 200 years. But that was too close. I figured everybody knew about that one, so I put in EDP. Someone asked me last time about the Squire Cheney farm and where it was relative to Cheney University. It's actually right across the street, more or less. The street somewhere over in this area, Cheney's behind that. There's actually a township park now between the road and this property. But this driveway today leads into a housing development. This is part of the housing development. New Thornbury Township was built in 1797. The barn was put up in 1804, modified in 1820. It grew as a farm. It started off as subsistence farming, where they grew what they needed, and eventually it turned into more commercial farming, cheese, butter, eggs, milk. And in 1881, they actually built what was thought to be the first silo in Chester County. That's since been torn down. It's not visible today. Westminton Highlands. In this case, the 1947 is not a renovation. This is the period in which people were building farm buildings in this area. It's roughly southwest of Birch Runville. It's between Birch Runville Road and Horseshoe Trail, and there are 3 little cross streets, at least one of which is not paved. Cheney Lane, I think that was called, but this is considered to be the largest agricultural complex still remaining in northern Chester County. And the township in the nomination form says, this is what the other surrounding townships look like before all the developers moved in. And my wife will tell you, I do like to go out there from time to time just to drive around and look at the farms. It's been known as that since the Revolution times, by the way. Hockney Mill Farm is on Warwick Furnace Road. The mill is on the south side of the road. It's actually the second mill. This later replacement was built in 1805. Today, it supposedly looks pretty much the way it did when they built it. There have been some changes. Obviously, the siding is new. I believe this little waste area up here was probably down above this one, and the chimneys moved around a little bit. But overall, it looks much as it did in 1805. Right across the street is the farmhouse. And this is interesting. And the nomination says this reflects the growth of an agricultural area in the county over 250 years. There was originally a stone house located about where this section of the house is. Later they built a stone addition over here. Anybody know what a coin is? When you come to architecture? Q-U-O-I-N. You're right. If you've ever built Legos with your kids or grandkids, if you ever have to tie 2 corners together, you can turn a block sideways to do that. Well, that's what the coins are. You can probably see one a little better here in the middle. These blocks that are turned sideways are coins. So they had coins to make this a freestanding addition, but when they replaced the log house with a stone house, they actually left the original coins in place. So if you drive by this, you can still see the coins from the original addition up there in this wall. This is actually a basement level. As time went on, they actually built an addition on this end, which was not connected to the house by a doorway. You had to go outside to get into it. It was apparently used for butchering and some other things like that. They eventually did connect the two, and then in the 1960s, they put the second floor addition on. Renton's Mill is on Creek Road between 926 and Chadsford. This used to be Route 100 before they rerouted 100 along the Exton Highway. There's a granary, there's a mill. At the time of the nomination, this was still active. There is a stone house, but this is not the original stone house. I believe it's built on the foundation, and they tried to copy what had been there, but it is not the original. mill serviced the area for a while, obviously. I added art to this one because this was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Life. Totally opposite from farm, even though we got farms in the name up here, is the Farmers and Mechanics Building in Westchester, and this is right downtown. It's the corner of Market and High Streets. Built strictly to impress people. They were trying to convince people that banking and commerce in Westchester was as solid as it was in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York City. It was Westchester's first skyscraper. It had Westchester's first roof garden, although I don't think that's still there. And it's still a pretty impressive building. Also in Westchester, we have the Sharple Separator Works. Sharple's invented and built the first American invented and built centrifugal separator used to separate cream from milk. At the time they built this, it was the largest industrialized, mechanized facility in Westchester. 1909 is not when it shut down. That's when the last building was built. They had a number of buildings they put in here. That separator turned out to have many uses, and it was kind of a prototype and evolved over the years. At the time the nomination was written, it was used for things like the production of instant coffee, separating blood components, producing life-saving drugs, and even oil exploration. And did so well, I think the company got big enough, they combined with somebody else, and eventually did shut down operations here, and this today is an apartment complex. The architectural aspect, as you know, Westchester is largely built on a grid pattern, north, south, east, west. This is not a vanishing point. These buildings actually are at an angle to each other, which is very unusual for the Westchester area. The Ashton Hotel is the only Italianate structure in Westminton Township, built in 1859 in conjunction with the Chester Valley Railroad, which ran out behind the building on an angle and came up here to intersect with what's today Route 30, which is what you're looking at here. It did have a ticket office for the railroad. It had a post office for a while. Then it became an eating house, boarding house, hotel. And the day I took this picture, there was actually a banner across the railing that said for lease. So I'm not really sure what it's being used for now. The banner's not there because I played with this through my digital post-processing one to get rid of it. But that still sits there. It's actually quite a pretty building. Okay, we're going to wrap up, and I actually get done on time, Mark, with 4 historic districts. Since I do have a minute, I'm going to tell you, I personally find historic districts somewhat frustrating because the justification in the nomination forms sometimes will get very detailed. You know, this building did this, and this building did that. But they're all identified, and there's obviously a map or a drawing that goes with them to tell you exactly what buildings you're looking at. Those maps and drawings are not available online. So to some extent, when I was taking the pictures, I had to guess by saying, well, that looks like an old building. But the ones I'm showing you tonight, I'm pretty confident in them being part of the historic district. So Hamilton is actually 2 different periods. There's an old Hamilton and a new Hamilton. Old Hamilton was a crossroads village. Basically, where what today is Route 1 and Route 52 came together. It was characterized, this is Route 1, characterized by these very long, narrow lots. You can probably see from this overhead view. If you can't, come on up later and I'll show you a better picture of it. But obviously, when they put Route 1 in, this became a little bit dangerous for people. So today, most of these are more or less closed off on this side, and everybody lives out in the backyard. The other thing about that, though, is if you drive by on Route 1, you're probably never going to see New Hamilton. New Hamilton is up here. It was built in 1930 by Pierre DuPont. He wanted to build 18 houses for some of his favorite employees at Elmwood Gardens. So they went and built some houses, which you can imagine, built by DuPont, occupied by people who worked at Longwood. This is a pretty nice area. But as I said, you'll probably never see it unless you know where to turn to get into it. They originally, Longwood took care of these for folks, but they eventually did sell them either to the occupants or in some cases descendants of the original tenants. Hopewell Historic District, this is not Hopewell Furnace, which is in Berks County and comes into a little bit of Chester. This is down in southwest Chester County. It's actually a couple miles west of Oxford. At one time, it was the 3rd largest borough of Chester County by land. was settled by a Scotch-Irish family. Their name was Dickey. They were very industrious. They used something called a water ram to take water from the creek that runs through. I apologize, I'm a creek person, not a creek person. They took water from the creek and they pumped it up onto the hillsides to irrigate their crops. They did a lot of experimentation with fertilizer. They ran a mill and some other commercial type activities. My wife was a teacher, so my eyes always light up when I see education. They were very instrumental in educational, or very active in educational activities. This is one of the Dickey's houses, but after a while they turned it into something called the Hopewell Academy. And this was in operation until roughly the 1860s, at which time it closed. That was Civil War time. At that time, the Dickeys were kind of losing money, and things settled down, and they eventually lost their borough status. Today, it's just kind of a quiet area. You go down there and drive through it. You can still see some of the buildings, but a lot of trees and whatnot. Trimbleville, settled by Quakers mostly, many of whom were related to each other. Trimble's Ford is in this district. That's the crossing that the British Army used on their way to the Battle of Brandywine when they crossed this branch of the Brandywine Creek. It represents just a very rural Chester County, lovely Chester County hamlet and agricultural area. Again, when we get to the education aspect, there was a gentleman named Jonathan Gauss who was apparently a fairly well-known educator. He started off teaching at the Friends School at Marshallton. He then went to teach at the new Westchester Academy. Stayed there a few years, got involved in a salary dispute, came back to a farm he owned in Trimbleville, started a school there for a while. Then he went back to the Westchester Academy. And apparently he moved Westchester Academy back to his farm, and it became Greenwood Dell, which is what you're looking at here. And then after a while, he went off and became the president of the new Unionville Academy. And then he finally came back and wound up at Greenwood Dell, which was a boarding school. One of their famous students was a gentleman, his name escapes me, we talked about him last time. He was the America's first travel author. I'm sorry if I've lost the name. So this is Trimbleville. Worth Jeffers Rural Historic District. Again, the time frame here is not renovation. This is just, there's been settlement over the years. And this is on the register because it's a largely agricultural area and the architecture reflects the changing styles through the years. There are 10 major farms in the district. It's right where the Brandywine splits into the east and west branches and sits between the branches. That area was actually surveyed by William Penn's surveyor way back when, and the western and southern boundary of the district supposedly pretty much follow those original survey lines. Owners tended to plant trees along the property lines. Some call them hedgerows, some don't, but if you look at an overhead view of this area, it looks a little bit like a patchwork quilt. This is the Allerton Farm, which is one of the 10 farms. This is the Lucky Hill Farm. I think this is a newer building here. They did sell a large part of Lucky Hill Farm to a developer, but they said that doesn't detract too much because the houses are kind of out of sight and you can't really see them from the road. If any of you are familiar with the Natural Lands Trust Stroud Preserve, which is down near Westchester, that's on the old Georgia farm, which was part of this district. And the 1740 workhouse is actually on that preserve, although it's not open to the public. You can't get to it. And we're going to wrap up with Pottstown Landing. There was a trail that ran up to the Schuylkill River. It was used by Coventry Forge to get its materials up to the river. In the late 1700s, farmsteads started to be built along the trail. There was one on the west side of the trail at the north end, and I'm pretty sure this is the original farmhouse. His brother built a farmstead on the southern end, also on the west side, and then there was a third farm on the east side. Then in the 1800s, someone decided to put in the Schuylkill Canal. And the east side of this trail, which by now is called Laurelwood Road, was developed to provide the houses and the shops for the people associated with the canal activities. Then eventually, the canal went away, and in the 20th century, developers came in and bought the west side of the road, and they built basically bedroom housing for people working in Pascal. So the farm on the east, most of that land was taken away to make room for the Coventry Mall. And if you're familiar with 724, if you go right past the mall, there's a traffic signal, that's Laurelwood Road. If you make a right turn, there's an ice cream parlor right on your left. That sits in the barn from the southernmost of the three farms, and I believe the farmhouse is just to the north of it. So, that district runs from roughly on Laurelwood Road, 724, up to where 422 goes across it. And 422 in that area does follow the path of the old canal. So, my time is up. We covered 30 places. I'll try to answer any questions anybody has, and thank you for your attention. No questions?
Questions?
Okay.
You talked about Hamilton District.
Yes.
And about the new Hamilton. Now, I've been down that area many, many times. And how would one access the new Hamilton
I
District?
think it's called Elmwood Road. There is a traffic signal on Route 1 at that road, and if you're,
Yeah, well, I know where 52 and Route 1 meet.
if you're heading south on 52
Yep.
and get to 1, you make a left turn heading east. And I believe it's the next traffic light is, I want to call it Elmwood.
Okay.
If you're coming from the other direction, there is probably a little side road that doesn't have a traffic signal. That's the other side of the development. It's kind of like a horseshoe.
Okay. I'll have to look it up. I'll have to look it up and hit that area.
Anybody else?
I think so, that'd be good.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dave.